What if the person you humiliated held your fate in their hands all along? They sneered at her clothes. They laughed at her silence. They believed they were untouchable. But behind that modest smile was the storm that would rip everything they built apart. Tonight, the masks will fall, the mighty will kneel, and the world will see what happens when cruelty chooses the wrong target. Stay until the end. If you dare. The revolving glass doors of Sterling Industries spun with a mechanical hiss, spilling Amelia Brooks into a lobby so polished, so vast, it seemed to swallow her whole, the marble floors gleaming like ice under the cold fluorescence of chandeliers, designed more to intimidate than to welcome. And for a moment, she simply stood there, clutching her worn leather bag against her side, feeling the weight of 100 indifferent stares prickling against her skin. The reception desk loomed ahead, manned by a woman whose tailored blazer and sharp crimson lipstick screamed that mistakes were not tolerated here. And as Amelia approached, her simple gray dress and scuffed flats drawing unwanted attention, the receptionist's smile tightened into something brittle and disdainful, her manicured hand hovering just above the call button, as if afraid to actually touch the same air as Amelia. "Name," she snapped, not looking up from her screen. And when Amelia answered, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart, the woman's perfectly arched eyebrow lifted with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Take a seat," she said, waving vaguely toward a row of gleaming chrome chairs lined against the far wall. But as Amelia turned, she caught the barely concealed sneers of the other candidates already waiting, all dressed in sharp suits and expensive watches, their briefcases gleaming like trophies at their feet. A young man in a navy blazer leaned over to the woman next to him, murmuring just loud enough for Amelia to hear. "Lost. Maybe homeless shelters that way." Laughter rippled between them, quick and ugly, but Amelia kept walking, choosing the farthest seat from the group, her cheeks burning, but her spine straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her shrink. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, as candidates were called one by one, their names announced crisply, their exits through the double doors beyond the reception desk, brisk and confident, while Amelia remained invisible, a ghost haunting a world she was never meant to enter. Her fingers tightened around the fraying strap of her bag, her mind battling the rising tide of doubt, whispering that maybe she didn't belong here, that maybe they were right to laugh, to dismiss, to overlook. The receptionist's voice finally crackled to life again, snapping Amelia from her spiraling thoughts, and without so much as a glance, she barked, "Brooks! Amelia! Room B!" No, oh please, no courtesy, just a command tossed like a bone to a stray dog. Amelia rose, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress with shaking hands, and made her way toward the heavy oak doors that separated the lobby from whatever trials awaited her beyond, her footsteps too loud in the cavernous silence, every beat echoing the same brutal question. "What are you doing here?" But she didn't turn back. She didn't run. She simply placed her hand on the cold brass handle, drew a slow breath into her tight chest, and pushed forward into the unknown, unaware that on the other side of that door, her life, and the fate of everyone who had dared to look down on her, was about to change forever. The hallway beyond the heavy oak doors stretched out like a corridor in a fortress, lined with sleek black panels and gold inlays, every inch screaming exclusivity. And, as Amelia Brooks followed the narrow runner carpet toward room B, the air grew thicker, the murmurs louder, the glances sharper, because here, the other candidates were not merely waiting their turn. They were predators circling what they perceived as weakness. And Amelia, in her plain dress and second-hand shoes, was blood in the water. A man in an immaculate gray suit leaned casually against the wall, his Rolex catching the overhead lights as he smirked openly at her approach, nudging the woman next to him with an elbow, his voice pitched just low enough to seem subtle, but just loud enough to slice through the air. "Looks like HR's getting desperate," he said, laughter rumbling from a few others standing nearby, their expensive perfumes thickening the air with the sour scent of arrogance. The woman beside him tilted her head, surveying Amelia with a lazy cruelty. "Maybe they're looking for janitors. she said, her lips curling into a smile so sweet it turned Amelia's stomach. And again came the ripple of low laughter, casual and brutal in its certainty that she was less, that she was other, that she did not belong. The assistant coordinating the interviews, a woman with a headset and a clipboard, barely concealed her disdain as she approached Amelia, tapping the pen against the folder she held. "Please wait," she said curtly, not bothering to meet Amelia's eyes before turning on her heel and whispering something to the other staff, who chuckled like school children plotting a prank. Amelia lowered herself into one of the rigid leather chairs lining the hall, the cushion cold and unyielding beneath her, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was sure they could see it through the thin fabric of her dress. Across from her, another applicant, a woman dressed head to toe in designer black, pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll while deliberately angling the camera at Amelia, snapping a photo before muttering, #charity case. The words hit harder than she expected, a cold slap that left her breathless, but Amelia said nothing, did nothing, her hands folded calmly in her lap, even as her soul ached to retreat, to vanish, to run far away from the stifling cruelty pressing in from every side. Minutes ticked by, dragging like chains across broken stone, until finally a young assistant called out names, ushering applicants one by one into gleaming conference rooms beyond the hall. The names called in an order that made it painfully clear that Amelia was not a priority, that she was, at best, an afterthought. She watched them go, heads high, designer heels clicking sharply, leaving behind only the ghost of their laughter, the faint, bitter taste of their scorn. Still, Amelia remained seated, still and silent, her fingers tracing the edge of the frayed leather strap across her bag, her mind a war between the deep, gnawing hurt that wanted to devour her and the stubborn flame that whispered, "Not yet, not yet, not yet," when at last the assistant called her name. Not with professionalism, but with a heavy, impatient sigh. Amelia stood, smoothed the front of her dress one more time, and walked forward, not with the easy arrogance of the others, but with a quiet, unyielding grace, stepping through the door to room B, as if walking into a battle she had been training her whole life to fight. They thought they had already crushed her. They thought they had already won. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't begin to comprehend, was that Amelia Brooks was not here to beg for a place among them. She was here to decide who would be allowed to stay when the walls they worshipped came crumbling down. The door clicked shut behind Amelia Brooks with a sound far louder than it should have been, sealing her into a room that gleamed with sterile perfection. A rectangular table stretching down the center under harsh white lights, surrounded by 6 interviewers in sharp suits and colder smiles, their polished folders stacked neatly before them like weapons laid in preparation for battle. Amelia crossed the floor, her footsteps muted by the thick carpet, every movement observed with the kind of detached amusement usually reserved for something caged and pitiable. And when she reached the lone chair positioned awkwardly at the far end of the table, she paused, feeling the weight of their judgment pressing down on her thin shoulders before she even sat. The man in the middle, a senior HR executive with salt and pepper hair and a gold pen poised theatrically between his fingers, leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes rake over her from head to toe with a smirk that didn't bother to hide its contempt. "Ms. Brooks," he drawled, tapping the pen against his folder. "Thank you for gracing us with your presence today." A chuckle rippled softly around the table, and Amelia knew instantly it was a trap, that no answer she gave would earn respect in this room, that the game had been rigged from the moment she had stepped through those polished glass doors. Another interviewer, a woman with sharp red nails and an even sharper tongue, tilted her head with mock curiosity. "Tell us," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "What made you think Sterling Industries was the right fit for someone like you?" The word "someone" hung in the air like a slur, and Amelia forced herself to smile faintly, refusing to let them see the sting land. She spoke, her voice calm, measured, but the panel wasn't listening. Not really. They had already decided what they wanted to see, a desperate woman, out of her depth, clinging to impossible dreams. They exchanged glances, smirks, little shrugs of dismissal that cut deeper than any shouted insult could have. The head interviewer tapped his pen again, louder this time, and interrupted mid-sentence. "Let's be honest," he said, his voice oozing condescension. "You're not exactly what we're looking for. Appearance matters here. Ms. Brooks, presentation, image, our brand is built on excellence." He leaned forward slightly, the glint in his eye sharp enough to bleed. "Would you feel comfortable representing our company?" Dressed like that, another low chuckle slid down the table, sticky and cruel, as if her simple dress and worn shoes were a personal offense to the marble and glass perfection around them. Amelia sat very still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, every muscle in her body screaming to fight, to flee, to scream that she was worth more than their shallow measurements. But she did none of those things. She simply smiled a little more, a soft, knowing smile that none of them understood. The woman with the red nails flipped a page in her file theatrically. "I think we're done here," she said with a smirk, not even bothering to hide the triumph in her voice. "Unless you have something miraculous to add. Ms. Brooks." Amelia rose slowly, smoothing the skirt of her dress with a steady hand, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling. Understanding, pity even, as if she were the one offering them forgiveness they didn't deserve. "No," she said quietly, her voice cutting clean through the room. "I believe I've seen everything I needed to see." And without another word, without a glance back at the stunned faces that could not comprehend how easily she walked away from their poisoned throne, Amelia Brooks turned and left the interview room, each step carrying her closer to the moment when the balance of power would shift forever, and those who had laughed would find themselves begging for mercy they would not receive. The door swung shut behind Amelia Brooks with a soft, final thud, but its echo seemed to linger far longer than it should have, an invisible crack splintering the smug composure of the interview panel left sitting around the gleaming table. One of the assistants, a junior HR staffer, no older than 23, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing without knowing that something colossal had just slipped through their fingers. But he said nothing, dared nothing, because in Sterling Industries, hierarchy ruled like iron, and no one questioned the ones seated at the top, not until the top came crashing down. Barely 2 minutes after Amelia's exit, the head of HR's phone buzzed sharply against the table, the vibration slicing through the stale, self-satisfied air. He snatched it up with a scowl, glancing at the screen, and instantly his face drained of color, the blood retreating so quickly it was as if the name displayed had physically slapped him. Without a word, he stumbled to his feet and gestured frantically for the others to follow, pushing through the doors into the private administrative hallway beyond, where the company's real power played unseen by the lower floors. The call was from the chairman's office. Not a secretary, not a lower aide, but the personal line used only when the matter could not wait, when consequences were immediate and irreversible. The HR director answered with trembling fingers, and the voice that crackled through the line was as cold and sharp as a blade dipped in liquid nitrogen. "Prepare conference room 1, the voice said. "Now, President Brooks will be arriving in 10 minutes. I want the executive team assembled, all of them." The phone dropped from his ear before the call fully ended, his hand shaking, the enormity of the mistake dawning with brutal clarity. President Brooks, Amelia Brooks. The name, the face they had just ridiculed, dismissed, humiliated, belonged not to some desperate job seeker, not to some charity case they could mock for sport, but to the majority shareholder and undisputed chairwoman of Sterling Industries, the real owner, the real power, the woman who had just watched them reveal exactly who they were when they thought no one important was looking. Panic rippled through the administrative floors like wildfire. Assistants scrambled to polish the already gleaming floors, to adjust chairs, to fetch water and arrange nameplates, desperate to erase the rot that had already been exposed too late. In the executive elevators, senior VPs whispered frantically, checking their emails, wondering how such a catastrophic oversight could have happened, who would be scapegoated, Who could possibly survive the wrath of a betrayed owner? Meanwhile, down in the lobby, the receptionist who had first sneered at Amelia fumbled with her computer, pretending not to notice as security detail in crisp black suits entered through the main doors, scanning the room with the precision of a Secret Service advance team. And at the heart of it all, walking calmly back through the building with her chin lifted and her stride unhurried, came Amelia Brooks. No longer the invisible, underestimated applicant they had mocked, but the woman about to turn their entire world inside out. She was not here to plead for a job. She was here to decide who deserved to stay in the kingdom she had quietly ruled all along. The towering glass doors to Conference Room 1 parted with a solemn groan as Amelia Brooks stepped through, flanked not by handlers or assistants, but by her own unshakable calm, her plain gray dress suddenly more regal than any designer gown in the stunned eyes of the executives who scrambled to their feet, their faces blanched, their bodies rigid with a fear they could no longer disguise, the room itself humming with the kind of electricity that only precedes the irreversible. The unforgettable. At the head of the mahogany conference table stood Philip Grant, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Industries, a man who had built his empire on control, on appearance, on never being caught off guard, yet now, as he laid eyes on Amelia, the certainty in his spine crumbled, and without hesitation, without pride, he bowed his head low in a gesture of respect so deep it was almost an apology, almost a prayer for mercy. "Madam President," he said, his voice rough with tension, "welcome." A collective gasp shuddered through the executive team, the reality slamming into them harder than any lawsuit or scandal ever could, and the HR directors, the recruiters, the panelists who had so confidently laughed at Amelia just hours earlier, stood frozen in horror, watching the woman they had discarded now command the very ground they knelt upon. Amelia walked slowly to the head of the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished surface, the gesture more powerful than any shouted decree, and when she turned to face them, her expression was not one of anger, nor triumph, but of something infinitely more unsettling. Quiet, measured judgment. She allowed the silence to stretch, the weight of it forcing every man and woman in the room to confront the truth of who they were when they thought power belonged only to the beautiful, the polished, the ones who fit their narrow mold. She lifted her chin, her voice steady, clear, needing no amplification. "Earlier today," she said, "I entered this building not as your president, but as a woman seeking opportunity, respect, and simple decency." Her gaze swept over them, pinning each one to their guilt. What I received instead was cruelty, dismissal, mockery. She let the words hang, slicing into the air like a scalpel. "You judge my worth by the fabric of my dress, the scuffs on my shoes, the absence of designer labels on my skin. You exposed yourselves, not me." Philip Grant swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tightening, but he said nothing, knowing better than to interrupt the reckoning he himself had called down upon them. Amelia's voice dropped lower, softer, yet somehow even more devastating. "You failed the simplest test any human being can face," she said, "the test of kindness." She turned slowly, letting the room absorb her words, letting them drown in the reflection of their own cowardice. "And now," she said, her tone sharpening, "there will be consequences." She reached into her simple bag, pulling out a thick leather portfolio marked with the embossed seal of the Sterling Board of Directors, and placed it on the table with a finality that rang louder than any gavel. "Effective immediately," she said. "A full review of Sterling's hiring practices, leadership conduct, and corporate culture will begin. Those found guilty of discriminatory behavior will be terminated without severance. No exceptions, no appeals." A woman at the far end of the table, one of the senior HR managers who had laughed most loudly at Amelia, gasped, a hand flying to her mouth, but Amelia's eyes merely flicked over her, colder than stone, immune to the sudden, too late regret. "You thought you were interviewing me," Amelia said quietly, "but it was I who was interviewing you." And in the hollow, echoing silence that followed, the foundations of Sterling Industries, and of every arrogant heart that had dared underestimate the power hidden beneath humility, began to crumble, piece by trembling piece. The heavy silence cracked open as Amelia Brooks sat calmly at the head of the table, her hands folded before her, radiating a kind of stillness that made the executives across from her shift uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting anywhere but her face, as if avoiding her gaze could somehow undo the brutal reality unfolding around them. Philip Grant, who had once been the unchallenged king of this marble empire, stood stiffly at her side, beads of sweat gathering at his temples despite the icy air conditioning, waiting for the verdict he knew was coming, because there was no undoing what had been revealed, no apology grand enough to cover the rot that had been exposed in full daylight. Amelia's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel through silk. "Bring them in," she said softly, and at her command, 2 members of her personal legal team entered the room, carrying thick binders filled with documentation, complaints, video footage, and recordings. Evidence that the cancer within Sterling Industries had not been an isolated incident, but a culture, festering and tolerated under the guise of standards and brand image. The binders landed with heavy thuds on the table, and with each slam, another layer of pretense shattered. Philip Grant cleared his throat, attempting to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Madam President," he began, his voice strained. "Surely there's a way to handle this internally, quietly, to protect the company's reputation." Amelia turned her gaze on him, so cold and steady that he faltered mid-sentence, the rest of his plea dying unspoken in the air. "The reputation of Sterling Industries," she said, her voice low but slicing like glass, "was destroyed the moment this behavior became acceptable under your leadership." She opened the top binder, her fingers flipping expertly through pages until she found the list she sought. Names typed neatly in black ink, the same names that had laughed at her, belittled her, and treated her like dirt not hours before. "Effective immediately," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Jessica Langston, Director of HR. Terminated, Robert Pierce, Senior Recruitment Manager. Terminated, Monica Reyes, VP of Corporate Affairs. Terminated." She went down the list, each name another domino falling, another career obliterated not by anger, but by simple, clinical justice. The individuals named rose in protest, voices sharp and desperate, throwing out excuses, apologies, frantic denials, but Amelia merely lifted one hand, silencing the room with the same effortless authority she had carried into the building from the beginning. The authority of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. "You were given power," she said, her voice softer now, almost sorrowful, "and you used it to belittle, to humiliate, to destroy. You failed not just yourselves, but the vision this company was built upon." Security appeared at the doors like silent shadows, waiting for her signal, and when she gave it with a slight nod, they moved with swift, impersonal efficiency, escorting the disgraced executives out one by one, their protests swallowed by the thick walls and the stunned silence of those who remained. When the last of the guilty had been removed, Amelia turned her attention to the rest of the room, to the handful of employees who had watched everything unfold without cruelty, without joining in the mockery, the ones who had lowered their eyes instead of sneering, the ones who had dared to look uncomfortable with what they saw. "For those who stood silent," Amelia said, "you have a choice. You can rebuild this place with me, brick by honest brick, or you can leave with those who thought this company's soul was expendable." No one moved, no one dared breathe, and in that breathless, broken moment, Sterling Industries was reborn. Not with champagne and confetti, but with justice, with humility, with the unshakable truth that no empire built on cruelty could ever stand against the quiet, invincible power of a woman who knew exactly who she was. The echoes of footsteps and slammed doors faded into a tense, waiting silence as Amelia Brooks remained standing at the head of the table, her presence filling the cavernous conference room with a gravity that none dared defy, and in the absence of the fallen, the remaining executives sat rigidly, each one keenly aware that survival now depended not on their titles, not on their polished resumes, but on something far rarer: character. Amelia let the silence stretch, sharpening it into a blade that stripped away all illusions, all lingering arrogance. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that carried judgment and grace in the same breath. Sterling Industries will no longer be a place where value is measured by the cut of a suit or the shine of a shoe, she said, her gaze sweeping the room, pinning each remaining executive like butterflies under glass. It will no longer be a fortress of exclusion, where kindness is seen as weakness and cruelty as strength. She paused, letting the words settle deep, carving their way into the very bones of the building. We will rebuild this company, she continued, her voice gaining strength, on the foundation of respect, of integrity, of seeing the human being before the resume, before the paycheck, before the packaging. Philip Grant, still standing stiffly to one side, dared to meet her eyes, finding there not the fury he feared, but something worse. Disappointment, deep and unshakable. He bowed his head again, not as a formality this time, but as an acceptance of his own failure. A man who had built an empire of glass and watched it shatter at the feet of the woman he had been too blind to recognize. Amelia stepped forward, the folds of her plain dress whispering against the marble floor, and placed a slim folder in the center of the table. This, she said, is the new Sterling Code of Ethics. Every employee, from the mailroom to the boardroom, will live by it or leave. She let that sink in, her gaze unwavering. Promotion will be based not only on performance, but on how you lift others as you climb. Hiring will be based not on appearances, but on potential and heart. Leadership will be earned by those who understand that power is responsibility, not privilege. Across the table, a young executive, one who had been silent during the earlier mockery, who had looked away in discomfort rather than joining in, leaned forward slightly, a flicker of hope lighting his face. Amelia saw it and allowed herself the smallest, briefest smile. It was enough. For too long, Amelia said, her voice soft but resonant, we have taught ourselves to see worth through broken lenses, lenses clouded by bias, by greed, by fear. Today, we discard those lenses. Today, we begin to see clearly. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just a heavy, sacred stillness. The kind that follows a vow made not with fanfare, but with blood and truth. Amelia straightened, her chin lifting, her voice dropping to a final, irrevocable decree. Its Sterling Industries will stand for something greater, and so will every one of you who chooses to stay. And as she turned to leave the room, her simple figure framed by the vast glass windows that overlooked the city she was about to change, the executives sat frozen, not as rulers of a kingdom, but as its humble stewards, knowing that the true lesson had been delivered not through punishment alone, but through the blinding, undeniable power of dignity reclaimed. The changes at Sterling Industries began not with a grand announcement or a flashy rebranding campaign, but with quiet, relentless precision, like the slow turning of the tide that reshapes a jagged shoreline. And at the center of it all stood Amelia Brooks, steady and unyielding, her simple presence a constant reminder that substance would no longer bow to spectacle. Within days, the marble lobby that had once served as a stage for casual cruelty was stripped of its velvet ropes and pretentious barriers, the gold-plated nameplates replaced by plaques that read in clean, simple letters, integrity, compassion, excellence, no longer mere words, but the commandments of a new era. Hiring practices were overhauled from the ground up, resumes reviewed without names or photographs, focusing only on ability, heart, and potential. And it wasn't long before the lobby filled with new faces, diverse, determined, and radiant with a kind of hope that Sterling had not seen in decades. Suits still came through the doors, yes, but so did worn jeans, bright eyes, and calloused hands, and under Amelia's leadership, they were all judged by the same measure: their courage to try and their character to persevere. Amelia walked the halls daily, speaking with janitors and junior analysts alike, her presence a living manifesto that no one at Sterling would be invisible again. That respect was not reserved for corner offices and padded titles, but given freely, fiercely, to everyone willing to stand and build with their own two hands. Philip Grant, once a figure of aloof power, took his place not above, but among the people, enduring the long, humbling process of unlearning the very culture he had once ruled. And though his pride bore deep scars, his gratitude to Amelia for forcing him to see what he had almost destroyed was carved even deeper. The transformation spread beyond the walls of Sterling, like wildfire carried on a righteous wind. Other companies watched nervously, then hungrily, realizing that the old metrics, image, wealth, pedigree, were losing their grip on a workforce that had tasted something purer and would never settle for less again. Corporate seminars shifted from branding optimization to empathy leadership. Job fairs buzzed not with boasts about salaries, but promises about dignity. Amelia launched the Brooks Initiative, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students and career changers from marginalized communities, pledging that no dreamer would be turned away from opportunity simply because their shoes were worn or their clothes unfashionable. The initiative's first class of scholars, 20 wide-eyed, fierce young talents, were welcomed onto Sterling's floors with open arms and open minds, and their work, brilliant and unorthodox, injected a new vitality into every project they touched. Amelia never sought the spotlight. She gave no interviews, refused photo ops, declined every magazine cover offered to her, insisting instead that the real story was not her triumph, but the triumph of every single soul who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or laughed at for daring to believe they were enough. And as she stood once again in the marble lobby 1 year later, watching a young man in a wrinkled shirt being warmly greeted by a senior vice president, Amelia smiled to herself, a small, quiet smile full of storms weathered and battles won without ever raising her voice. This was not just a company reborn. It was a world remade, one brick of humanity, one beam of dignity at a time. And Amelia Brooks, in her simple gray dress and her unbreakable spirit, had lit the match that set the whole hollow empire ablaze, so that something better, something truer, could rise from the ashes. The ripple effects of Amelia Brooks' quiet revolution at Sterling Industries spread further and deeper than anyone had anticipated, reaching beyond boardrooms and corporate policies into the very soul of an industry long calcified by vanity and greed. And soon, major news outlets picked up the story, not just of the firing of corrupt executives, but of the restoration of human dignity in a place that had almost forgotten it was built on the dreams of the unseen. Articles titled "The Woman Who Changed Corporate America" and "Humility Over Vanity," how Sterling Industries was reborn, flooded magazines and news feeds, igniting conversations in universities, coffee shops, and living rooms across the country, forcing companies to examine their own toxic cultures with a scrutiny they had long evaded. Leadership conferences rewrote their agendas, replacing panels on brand strategy with workshops on empathy and leadership and the ethics of power, often citing Amelia Brooks as the standard bearer for a new era they could no longer afford to ignore. CEOs who once scoffed at concepts like inclusion and emotional intelligence now scrambled to realign their company's values, desperate to prove that they, too, had learned the lesson Amelia had written, not with a whiteboard, but with her own bruised but unbroken heart. Inside Sterling, the transformation matured into something living, breathing. Not a publicity stunt, but a daily reality. Employees once silenced by fear now found their voices amplified, encouraged to question, to innovate, to belong. Promotions were no longer handed out in smoke-filled conference rooms to polish sycophants, but earned by those who lifted others up as they climbed. For the first time in decades, Sterling's profits surged not because of exploitation or image control, but because happy, valued employees produced work filled with real passion and pride. Amelia herself remained almost mythical in her simplicity. She still wore her plain dresses, still carried her worn leather bag, and still treated the janitor with the same respect as the CFO. She refused all offers for interviews, book deals, and TV specials, saying only, "The work is the story." And that, more than anything, made her legend grow. Her story became required reading in business schools, a case study of how the smallest, simplest voice could shatter the highest towers of cruelty. Aspiring entrepreneurs, dreamers, and young professionals scribbled her name into their notebooks not as an unreachable icon, but as proof that integrity could not just survive, it could win. 1 year to the day after that fateful interview, Sterling Industries held a gathering, not in a glittering ballroom, but in the lobby where it had all begun, now redesigned into an open space filled with natural light, living walls of greenery, and photographs of employees, as from interns to senior managers, but laughing, collaborating, living proof of the company's new soul. Amelia stood before them briefly, saying only, "This place is yours now. Guard it well. Build something here that no storm can tear down." She didn't need applause, though it thundered through the glass walls and echoed into the streets beyond. She didn't need titles, though she carried the authority of an empress who ruled not through fear, but through trust. And as she stepped quietly out into the cool afternoon air, blending into the flow of the city with the same unassuming grace as always, Amelia Brooks left behind more than a reformed company. She left behind a legacy. A living testament that the true measure of greatness is not how high you stand above others, but how fiercely you lift others alongside you. And in the end, it wasn't the marble floors, the million-dollar deals, or the gilded titles that mattered. It was the simple, indestructible truth that she had known all along. Kindness is power, integrity is armor, and dignity, real dignity, can bring an empire to its knees and build a new world from the rubble. They thought she was nobody. They thought she was weak, but the woman they mocked became the reckoning they never saw coming. Titles collapsed, power crumbled, and dignity, silent and unstoppable, claimed its crown. This was not just justice. This was a warning. The ones you dismissed today may be the ones holding your destiny tomorrow. Remember that before you ever laugh at someone again.